Hello, welcome to the Walker Art Center. My name's Pablo de Ocampo. I'm going to wait for my interpreter friend to come over here. Thanks. It's talking a little too fast. Again, my name is Pablo de Ocampo. I'm the director and curator of Moving Image here at the Walker Art Center. I am a middle-aged man with, a black and gray beard, short, wearing various colors of indigo and denim, with a knit cap on. And I'm standing on what is to you the right side of the stage, in front of a microphone and joined by an ASL interpreter here to my right and Alison O'Daniel to my left. We're here at the Walker Art Center, and we begin, many of our events here by just acknowledging that the Walker Art Center sits on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary homelands of the Dakota. This land, which was once an expansive marshland, held meaning for the Dakota, but for many other indigenous nations who live on and near and continue to live on and near this land today. I'm very excited to be here for the last phase of what's been a three-parter with Alison O'Daniel here at the Walker Art Center over the last year. Alison's been engaged in what we call a cinema residency here. So if you've been to something in the last little while, you may have heard me talk about this being a frame in which we try to offer up this space, the space of the cinema, as a space of research, a space of discovery, a space that artists can kind of both present their work and think about their work kind of together in the social space of a cinema with an audience. Alison's residency began with a screening of her feature film, The Tuba Thieves, last spring, in which we were kind of highlighting a brand new film for Alison, one that had just sort of come off of a very robust festival run and was getting a lot of attention. A really incredible, wonderful exploration of sound and listening and deafness within cinema and what those means. And so our invitation to Alison was to kind of come back to the Walker over a period of time and do some explorations of what does it mean to listen in a cinema? What is sound? What is the relationship of hearing or not hearing, deafness and hearing within a cinema context? So we had some other screenings last spring, and we're back for this last component. And so you are here for maybe what is both one of the most exciting components of the residency, but also maybe one of the most precarious, in that we are entering into the phase where Alison's inviting us to be with her as she starts to embark on a new line of thinking that emanates from her last film. And this is one of the things that we try to do at the Walker in many aspects, is really support artists in the work they do, in the experimental, radical thinking that they're going to do. And so we are here for two events with Alison this weekend. Tonight, the premiere of a film that she's going to talk a little bit more about in a moment called A Disaster. And then tomorrow we'll be back here to watch a disaster film, The Last Wave by Peter Weir. We're showing that on 35 millimeter, and it will have open captions presented along. It'll be presented with open captions. My other housekeeping notes. I took notes because there was a lot of things. As you know, I don't usually have notes. Just very quickly, I want to give some acknowledgement to the National Endowments for the Arts for the support of Alison's residency over the last year. I'm sure I'm speaking to a house that all knows that, but it is very important to have arts funding in the world. We don't know if we have that in the United States anymore, but we're thankful that we did have it for this program. And also to Lois and John Rogers for their additional support in supporting very specifically the creation of this new project, which Alison's going to be talking about in just a moment. So I hand it over to Alison.
Thank you so much, Pablo. First, I just want to start off by saying, such an emphatic thank you to you, Pablo, and to the Walker, for this opportunity, which is really rich for an artist. I honestly was saying earlier that in my research process, I usually make tons of spreadsheets, and I don't really get the opportunity to make a film as research. And it has actually resulted in what I think it was meant to do, which is really set me up for what is coming next. And that being said, I'm about to sit down and watch this with you for maybe the third time. You're about to watch something that really is in a very vulnerable state. And I'm actually quite nervous about this experience because it has problems, and it has some typos and certain things, that are just a little flimsy feeling to me. But the biggest thing that I feel maybe cautious about is that in my last film, The Tuba Thieves, I had 5 years of really getting very deep feedback from my larger deaf and hard of hearing community about how I was approaching captioning and the accessibility in that film, to the point that I really had the privilege of that time and process to kind of build and invent something that filled a gap of what I wanted and needed in terms of accessibility. And so this project is not that. I have not had that feedback at all. And so there are parts that I already know are not as accessible as I would like for them to be. And so one of the tools that I always provide when I show films is a balloon. And so you should have received a balloon when you came in, and I'd love for you to blow it up about like this big. And the reason for this is that it's both, for me, it's a tool for you, but it's also an homage to the history of social gatherings and deaf clubs, where people would watch movies and hold a balloon just to feel, physically access the soundtrack and feel, the vibration of the sound waves moving through the space. And so in this film, there is a lot of silence. And I want you to be able to rely on that balloon for that kind of trust, because I'm not captioning silence in this film. So, and there are also some other things that aren't captioned that we can talk about in the Q&A afterwards. And I really welcome you to ask any sort of clarifying questions about any of the content in the film. And then the other kind of like accessibility thing that I'll say is that there's also a ton of reading in this film. And so if you are like me and need like an updated eyeglass prescription, the text is I think it's pretty large, but if at any point you're like squinting and need to move, like take care of your body and shift in the space and do whatever you need to do. I think that's all I will say. And I do really, really hope that we can have a robust conversation afterwards, because in the spirit of this like sort of research, getting your feedback and your thoughts and your questions is really, really going to be actually like quite a milestone, because it is the first moment of me moving into my second feature film. And so I appreciate all of you being here, and I look forward to the conversation afterwards.
Okay, last note from me. Alison's film, A Disaster, is 49 minutes. And afterwards, I forgot to give a shout out to Evan Calder Williams, professor at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, who is one of my favorite partners to talk about movies with. Will be joining Alison to talk about the film afterwards. So stick around for that if you'd like. See you soon.
Okay, yeah, good evening all. Thank you, Alison. As Pablo mentioned, my name is Evan Calder Williams. I'm a writer, professor, and someone who's spent a lot of time, maybe too much, with disaster movies in my life, and written a lot about sort of apocalyptic ideology and spectacle, and especially in ways that I think, for me, make it really generative to talk with you about this, with the sort of limits of a certain kind of spectacularity, the ways in which these are forms that perhaps have stakes much higher than we tend to think. You note at the beginning in the text, it sort of says, I used to think of them as a sort of silly, funny, cathartic thing. Clearly there's a pivot beyond that. I think, one of the reasons that that's the case more broadly is really a question of something that's a term that I think often sounds quite cheesy, or we should save it from being cheesy, but this would be a question of kind of imagination. And I want to raise that because I think, in your film, there's such an investment in this, both in the level of form, in terms of the kind of use of the cutaway, right? The sudden dropping off of sound, the sudden break of a clip, this thing that kind of makes absence resonant in really particular ways. But also, I think, as I think for any of us watching this, whether or not you've seen all of the films that are kind of excerpted, particularly at the end, these are kind of moves we know. These are kind of the look, the turn towards the sound, that here we see the sight of someone hearing and hearing a sound that portends potentially their death. That's a kind of look that we know, right, that sort of overlays us. So I want to kind of keep coming back around maybe to this question of taking seriously the stakes of something like a kind of shared cultural imaginary, ones that often are not so much our choosing, and maybe the work that artists and filmmakers can do in actually trying to inflect that. As a way towards that, maybe I want to ask you first, the film is obviously called A Disaster, but in many ways the core of it, although we begin with the disaster film, the kind of endless, beautiful litany of that, and we return the end to this kind of recurring turn, right? Like the turn, the look. But much of the film really centers on, I would say, a different relation of harm, of threat, of the kind of unmaking of a world. And these are ones that we could think of less as accidents, so much as willful techniques, often wielded imperially and by states. So I guess as one way in, I want to ask you, and I know, this is a work in progress or fresh, which makes it, I think, so exciting. We've talked about it as a kind of research, a film that is its own research in some regards. But I think, I'd love to hear from you about how you're thinking of the connection between a kind of spectacular ideology of the accident in certain regards in relation to things that we would say are profoundly not accidental, and in fact often pass themselves under the sign of the incidental or the accidental. Oh, there just happened to be a certain kind of noise, etc. And yet we know these are kind of techniques of disorientation, often literally of kind of deafening, which I think is key. So maybe we can begin here with the relation for you between this sort of spectacle of disaster and, on the other hand, these often sort of carefully, quite sadistically wielded techniques, in which I do think the kind of question of sound and the weaponization of it is so key. But in some regard, it's obviously a slightly different relation to violence.
Yeah. I want to say two things through that question, which is like huge and heavy. And one, as I said before, this is like my third time to watch this. And so one of the things I always think about as someone who's deaf, hard of hearing is like, I'm in situations often where I am not hurt by things that, like, physically hurt by things that hearing people are, like sirens, microphone feedback. And so I think a lot about like the experience of being an artist or making a film and wanting to talk about something that is torturous or painful, and how do you critically do that without maybe reenacting the torture? And this, watching this, I was just feeling so bad for all of you, like, as I was watching this, because I was like, oh, I know that there's people in this room with really, really sensitive hearing. And like the homeless segment, the unhoused segment, when I was editing, I just was like so angry during that part. And yet, like kind of using those sounds and repeating the experience for people on one level, I hope it like sort of creates empathy. And on another level, I want to feel it. I want to feel that experience. One other thing I want to say before getting into the question is like a really interesting moment just happened where as you were first talking, you mentioned death. But you signed deaf, and it's an amazing thing that happens all the time in where, like, if you're texting deaf, it always says death, and captions often do that mistake. I've never actually seen it this flip, which is actually really, I mean, it's fascinating to me and really beautiful and interesting. And I hope you don't mind me pointing it out, but it's like really relevant, I think, to this, is sort of like thinking through an inverse or a flipping of like the language of cinema, the expected thing, the kind of trite like tool of cinema. And then like when, you know, I hope this is like still answering your question, but, you know, like I often think about when a film pretends to be speaking about something, but is actually really still harming. Or, you know, even something like, I think a really easy example is like Mad Men is sort of like talking about sexism, but then you're still experiencing like sexism and it's awful and uncomfortable, even though it's like seductive in its narrative space. Okay, so there were like 5,000 questions in your question, and like one thing, maybe could I get you to say something again about can we talk about the drop off, the cut, the hard?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think you mentioned wanting to walk this maybe a line between making listening painful to those who are hearing of a certain sort, while also not wanting to inflict that. And, you know, it's striking to me that through much of this film, the moments that feel most painful are perhaps not because of like a sonic consequence, but a part where you are through text, through like not just captions, because there's captions in here, but there's other moments I would say where essentially we're reading a story, we're reading dialogue, etc. And it is speaking towards something that is an image of pain, which we don't see as an image, nor do we hear the sounds of that pain. So, you know, in terms of the form that's active here, it feels like there's at least two things that might be interesting to kind of talk through. One, indeed, is something like the cut that produces a silence in some regard there. I think, you know, this question of the kind of co-location between sort of death and deaf that you're sort of pointing to, which I agree is very generative. You know, it's such a sort of historically potent, if not overdetermined one, I think, with this kind of sense of silence as equal to kind of deathliness. But I think what's really remarkable about the sound design here is how much you are sort of producing silence rather than treating it as a baseline. It's something that has to be made like in relation to the noise. So it feels like one of the formal moves that's at stake here indeed is this kind of sense of like, how do you make an absence felt, but also how do you not treat it as an emptiness? We spoke a little bit about this earlier, that I think what's so at stake here, but I also think is important, you know, beyond the film, is to think through forms of making that which is taken to be neutral or empty or sort of unthought, and attending to the kind of atmospheres or saturations or sort of static of a violence that moves through it. You know, we can also think about this in forms that are quite literal and chemical, forms of toxicity, for instance, that are constitutively unseeable, unhearable, and yet they're kind of working on us. So there's a kind of this is, I think, what I was starting to kind of want to think about with this sense of like the cut, you know, this sense of kind of producing that. The other side maybe as well, as alluded to by the sense of, I was saying something that's not quite a caption, but a sort of description here, is this really particular form of what, you know, in a longer maybe art, historical or literary context, we can talk about as ekphrasis. People talk about that as the sort of description of one medium via another. So famously, like, Ode to Aggression Urn. But here there's something really particular where like a scene that would be unbearable or kind of unseeable in some regard there, and that often is so much part of this like lexicon of global disaster films, etc., appears here only in text. And there's a kind of pathos to that. So I'd love to know more of how you're thinking about not just the use of text instead of image, but particularly a kind of text that is ekphrastic. That's to say, that is kind of like describing to us something that could be seen and is not shown here.
Yeah, I mean, I love that question because I think all the time about captions and
the experience, one thing I really reject about captions is this very subtle hierarchy that I think exists within them, which sometimes feels like there is a goal within captioning to like lift up a deaf person's experience to a hearing person's experience. And I find that like it is one of those secretive things that has all these kind of messages in it about like who is above and who is below. And I often think about like when the tools of accessibility that I need sometimes harm me. Like when I've stepped into something and it is both helping me and hurting me at the same time, and how hard that is to talk about, because we're just supposed to say thank you. And we are just supposed to appreciate, like, the one I always talk about that's the most obvious is just the music symbol. Like as a caption is just so egregiously missing what it is telling you is there. Yeah. And I say that like I have not captioned the music, the lyrics of the music in this. And one of the things I'm always wrestling with is like, what does it mean to like caption something without having the soundtrack there, which I think in here is really effective. But I'm always thinking about my deaf audience if I choose not to caption the lyrics and ask you to feel it through the balloon, it reinforces potentially the dominant sort of like forgetfulness or ignoring of a deaf audience, that experience we've had so many times of like coming into a theater and being like, all right, if I want to see captions, I have to go to a movie at 9 a.m. or something, on Wednesday, and that's my only option. Or just, there's just so many like things you're navigating all the time. And so I want to like really build a kind of world of deaf filmmaking where like even in the end, like what does it mean to watch people watching and never give you the kind of pleasure of the thing that is being seen? And then, or what does it mean to read captions but not have that sound there, but do it in a way that is so evocative that you can live inside the sound and not necessarily need the soundtrack. Like, I don't know if I'm ever successful in these things, but I'm trying to kind of pose questions to myself of like, could I achieve this? And so that acrostic thing that you're talking about, like that is what captions are doing. Like captions are describing a thing that there's an assumption within them that like they're for functionally deaf people who have zero hearing. And that is necessary, but also there's like a spectrum of deafness, and like we could actually just do a better job with that. Like how do we describe things? How does that become like another like evocative level of storytelling? There's pleasure within that rather than I guess like I'm playing so much with like sort of questions of like, what can a hearing ear handle and be exposed to? How can pain be like part of our? And I have a lot of questions about this right now, because for me, like I'm not happy in this world that we're in right now. I'm really angry, and I don't really want to be exposing. Like I would like to be contributing some like levity, but that's just not where I am right now, and I'm like really pissed. And so I just am kind of working through that in a way. And yeah, like trying to work through these things where something is representing something else, but then like cutting in the middle of it so that we don't get to sort of experience that like, I mean, I do hope there's some pleasure in watching this, and like, I'm not like a total sadist, but maybe in like the sort of typical realms of like what we expect in a film. I'm trying to kind of cut that cord right now a little bit, because I just feel like some things are really like, some big things are at stake, and I want to just like not let us numb out all the time. And even though that's also like the pleasure of movies, like I love them and I hate them and I love them. I love them so much.
I love them too. I want to pick up on, come back to this question of like numbness, this term you said. Prior to that, I want to flag one other thing, or put a pin in it, maybe for a much longer conversation than we can have tonight, of what you were saying about captioning and I think, questions of access. I think you've written notes about this. They're available on your website, which I think I'd strongly encourage you to kind of look at. And I think this sense of saying that, that which can help you also can hurt is so important, because I think there can be a certain fantasy of measures of accessibility that not only play it safe, but sort of imagine a sort of value neutral transposition of something. And I think that the way you're talking about it, that you're working on in this film, feels to me, crucially acknowledging this as something that moves away from a fantasy of some perfect frictionless translation in some, or a kind of recreation of something, like you're saying, as if like, there will ever be a way that is a perfect description of the music that is there, and instead to think of it as a kind of creative opportunity, right? That there's this striking way in which, of course, as someone who is hearing, when I read captions, one of the things that does, as someone who does not need them, and I would note there's a really good lecture you can find online, a video lecture by Emily Watlington that was done for Lux about sort of what does it mean for hearing people to be reading closed captions, particularly in kind of artist film practice. But just to say, like, as someone who is hearing, when I read them, and if they're done not even in a remarkable way, even a sort of mediocre form, I find that it qualifies and names things I have been hearing without noticing. You suddenly start being like, oh, God damn it, they are using that music again, right? You start to notice the patterns of like when the kind of soft symphony comes in. So just to say, I think, there's something really important and powerful, I think, that you're getting at here, and that I think is really worth adding always to conversations we want to have around access and kind of measures taken, which is to move away from anything that's a kind of, how would you put it? Yeah, a fantasy of perfect frictionless clarity, and instead to kind of say, like, there will be loss, there will be impasse, there will be hurt, there will be misprision. How do we see that as an opportunity to kind of like creatively amplify? Carol,
Sorry, you said there will be hurt, there will be...
things will be lost in translation, right, in some regard, and to see again these forms of like, the way of a description of something that you'd say never captures it perfectly, but opens up and qualifies and changes what we're watching differently. So I just wanted to note this. Yeah, please.
I mean, I think really good captioning does, and I've seen like plenty of really amazing good captioning that's, but I think it does actually, like if it's trying to kind of match a quality, but also like those moments where, like what you're saying of soft symphony coming in, or like the privilege of learning a character's names is often like one of the amazing little benefits of captioning, where you like get to know, like you can differentiate characters earlier. So that's one of those things that I think just like helps everyone. Anyway.
Yeah. And back to kind of numbness. You have the amazing sequence of all of the faces. And again, in many ways, most of those reaction shots are images or moments of someone hearing something that in that film, perhaps some people hear it, but in the version you have, it is silent. There's another kind of face, we spoke about this a little bit this afternoon, that runs through a history of kind of disaster films, which on the one hand, the kind of, not just the sort of agog reaction shot of what you see, but also something that's become really common, I've seen especially in films from the early 2000s on, which is an image of a kind of deafening. We were talking about this of like, you get this in war films, you get this in disaster films, where some tremendous sound, often an explosion, happens, and then what a hearing audience kind of then experiences is a kind of zeroing out of sound.
There's still usually a lot of sound,
exactly,
though, but it's like
it's this sort of it's a drone, it's a hum, it's a kind of tinnitus sound. And I wanted to ask, think about that, because that has a really particular function in those films. It often becomes this strange moment of pause of like, I don't know, Iron Man stumbling around and looking at the dust and having a kind of aesthetic encounter. But because you are so clearly thinking about the weaponization of sound in certain regards, but also the way in which it functions within, for instance, at the end of the disaster film, I was hoping you can say more about how you are seeing the, this kind of labor of deafening, or the kind of politics of sound within the disaster film as a genre, because you've spent so much time now kind of watching them and thinking with them. How are you, we talk so often about them, I've written about them a lot in terms of the limits of an imaging, a kind of spectacularity. We see this all the time, I think, with images of actual ecological devastation, the idea that there would be some image that is shocking enough, it will change action. And I think that often is not the case in the way we tend to think about it. But I think people talk much less about sound in this regard. So I want to ask you, how you are seeing the role that sound, as well as kind of deafening, is playing within the sort of ideology of the disaster or of the accident.
It's so interesting. I legitimately, I'm having a very deaf moment right now of you saying, oh yeah, like so many of those moments in the ending sequence are like people hearing things. And it's like, oh, right. Like, yeah, you're right. It's people like hearing something and then going to look. And I'm wondering right now if I really I'm identifying with the moments of seeing because of the thing where that relationship for deaf and hard of hearing people of ears and eyes switching roles all the time. So if I don't have my glasses on, I can't participate in any conversation because I do lip read. If I take out my hearing aids and my glasses, no way, I'm done. I'm out. And so for me, sometimes seeing people see is for me seeing people hear, I guess, it is what you just said. But I maybe there's something comforting that I'm magnetically kind of drawn to of well, I think in that last segment also the removing the disaster, watching people see the disaster but not giving you that disaster it's relocating for me. And also there's a sort of experiment of I'm really trying in that last segment to see if it's possible to have the same intensity without those bombastic soundtracks. So I think maybe that's the answer to this question is that I feel real true irritation about the way that sound is used in horror films and disaster films because it leads you without letting you have autonomy to interpret. So it's it's telling you how to start to feel scared, to start to feel, whatever, that's the sound design. And so I kind of want to prove that maybe there's a deaf contribution to filmmaking that you can actually watch something and still experience that kind of intensity of when I watched that ending segment, I really realized that my eyes get they start to mirror their eyes. I realize I'm opening my eyes really wide as they're starting to get more and more, agog. And I just kind of want to propose something in the history of filmmaking that we can do this without always relying on very specific vocabularies of sound. Let's expand it, not just remove sound and do it only through visuals, but let's just think bigger about what sound design does in those moments. Conversely, I will also say that I think a very real deaf pleasure that I get in watching disaster films is the use of the really sub-bass deep rumble. I just love it. And when you have natural disasters like earthquakes or volcanoes or whatever, that is going to be in the soundtrack. And so there is something so pleasurable to me about getting the sound of the film through my body instead of through my ears. And so there that is quite just simply a thing that I like about the disaster film is that there's always going to be this vibration that I just like to honestly sit inside of. so I think my answer is more about sound design and kind of the ethics, the unquestioned ethics of like this very somewhat narrow vocabulary of sound design, which I think it's formulaic and it's theatrical in a very particular narrow way.
Yeah, and I think by you removing that, there's a way in which the next shot that would come in all of these films of what those characters are seeing or a rumble they've heard, and then we get the shot, will never be as potent as the absence of seeing it in some regard, right? There's a way in which like those shots are also doing this particular work of trying to make us, like they're sort of showing us like, oh, you should also feel aghast at what you see. And then you're like, oh, it's a bunch of pixels sort of going over a CGI beach as Téa Leoni makes up with her dad before the wave hits them. Like that actually is what happens in, sorry, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Deep Impact. Deep Impact, interesting film. But just, I think...
there's 3 soundtracks in the opening credits. One is The Happening, one is Deep Impact, and one is Armageddon.
Yeah. And I think, there's a way in which... by removing that kind of indeed manipulative sort of standard order soundtrack design, but also withholding the shot that kind of comes, I think we both are able to see, in a way similar to a film by Matthias Müller called Home Stories, that has this sort of recursive gestures of people hearing someone at the door and we never get the reveal. We also, I think in this, if it asks us to kind of be amazed at what we see, and that often doesn't really work, the side I think that your work here is doing also reminds us, though, is the kind of unintended training we get from seeing all of these sort of things. There's a way in which, like, one never now sees a true disaster in the world without being shadowed by thousands of these
what
things.
is happening in LA
exactly
for the last few days is just like it's so frustrating to watch the basic theatrics of it. And then that is real.
Yeah, and there's still, I think, a kind of naive criticism that'll say, oh, this looks like a dystopian film, and what that misses is saying, like, this is meant to do that. Exactly. This is not somehow like a kind of accidental correspondence. There's a way in which, like, these are actions designed solely for the production of images that can be selectively circulated, right?
Yes.
I want to open up to other people to questions before we fully talk, as we should, about Los Angeles right now. But please, questions from anyone for Alison in the audience. We can take some time.
And also, if you have questions about, like, because I don't really explain what I mean. There's sometimes I say, like, Waco, whatever, the Branch Davidian compound, like, I explain some things, but I am leaving a lot of information out. So if anyone just wants me to, like, sort of fill in anything, I'm also totally happy to do that.
I think I saw a hand. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. I have a question. Okay. My name is Alyssa. And I think I'm understanding her. Yeah, I'm just having a hard time seeing. Yeah, maybe getting the light a little bit. Hi again. My name is Alyssa, and I have a question. I have 2 questions. I've been reading before about this, about the movie, and some of the terror, I felt some of the feeling of the disaster movie, but is this the right kind? Is this the right kind of seating in the auditorium? Is that the correct seat? Okay, let me just ask you here. So you mean like the seating in the auditorium? So where I'm sitting and looking at the field, I felt like I didn't feel it quite as much as I would like to. What I read, what you're supposed to feel and designed to feel, I was misinterpreting what I read. See, many of it is silence. A lot of it is really silence.
And I sound dysfunctional, and I'm hard of hearing deaf. So, I'm always
Okay, that's cool. Wonderful. And then my second question. At the beginning, let me see. There was a long time in the beginning where it was really dark, and all of a sudden the captioning came up, and then it was dark again. And I started feeling like I was getting a headache from that brightness, and then all of a sudden the darkness. It was visually hurting my head. So I don't know, because I'm not trying to be, hold on. I wanted to leave, and maybe at the beginning, there would be, if there was more pictures or something. I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, visually, it's like as people that are hearing, is it loud, how it affects their hearing. It's kind of visually, for us deaf people, visually painful.
I do think that this film is painful. And
I do think I do think that this film is very painful. And part of it is that also it's like there's just a lot of crunchy stuff going on in the film. Like, it's a lot of low res images, and I don't really understand why the red text was like pixelated, because it looked amazing in my version, but then like the ferret section was like gorgeous. So I don't know technically like why there's some like the sound design is like a little bit messy anyway. Just technically, there's some like technical stuff that I think is also just hard, you know. But I also am really playing with like long sections that are silent, that I hope are creating an equivalency in a deaf audience that like builds some questions, asks you to sort of deal with like versions of pain, and then in parts where the sound is really like sort of intense or sharp, that's also sort of like asking maybe a hearing audience to like navigate some of that pain. But like I said before, I am not interested in recreating torture. So it's, like this is a thing that I will navigate as I move into dealing with some of these heavier elements of the film, or of the subjects that I'm interested. I always think about like, you know, how do I stay mentally healthy as I make a project over several years? And then how do I like create an experience for the audience that is cultivating curiosity, keeping you on that line of maybe wanting to walk out. Like, I do like that sort of intensity. At the same time, I don't want to foment total hatred or like absolute pain. You know, I hope that is still
sort
interesting.
of a balance, you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It was one thing. It was amazing. It was amazing. Thank you for making this film. It's very important for equal access. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to take one more question, or maybe more than one.
Now there's
three many
questions.
hands. All right, we can say them all at once and do like a chorus. We can do a couple.
Thank you. I have one comment, just thinking about crossovers with low vision and blind cinema. There are some areas, I wonder if you think about that. And two, I'm curious about your research process. There are a lot of portals. There's a lot of directions. So what did you spend, how did you spend your time in this research process?
For this, this is not a film at all yet. This first, like, I don't even know if I would call this like, this is like version 0.0001, so there's no audio description, obviously, like that's been done for this. But absolutely, in my next feature film, or if I like continue to develop a disaster in the research process, which actually this has been really fruitful for me. I like to collaborate. It's very important to me that the captioning is done by deaf and hard of hearing people. So I usually do a lot of it, and I bring in other friends. Like I have some friends who are really good at captioning music, and I'm terrible at it. And then it's really important to me that the audio description is done by blind and low vision people. And so I have friends who helped me with produced, designed, wrote, did all of the audio description for my last film, The Tuba Thieves. And so I will absolutely do that for the next film as well. And my friend Andy Slater in particular, who did the audio description for The Tuba Thieves, he's just such a poet, and I feel like we're really on the same level in terms of how we're thinking about our different forms of access. So he would be really fun. He would have a lot of fun with this as it is right now. And yeah, so that's the answer for that. And then how is my process is usually I start projects with titles, as I said in this. And that is like, I like the mystery of starting with like the definitive name for something and then building out. I often think that my process is very similar to like reversing the normal sort of establishing shot and then going to close-ups. Like I like to start with the close-up and then build towards a sort of gleaned establishing shot. I really like I really love the experience of compensation, which is a deaf experience that you're tested for in audiology, where you're missing stuff and you're trying to fill in all the blanks. And that has just been the most fruitful thing for me, to think of how do we move towards understanding something enough when there is so much that's missing. And so I like to start with the title, and then usually what seems to keep happening, it's happening again in my next film, is I usually sort of like zero in on a person who has created some of the sound on a previous project and then like build narrative for them. So the Foley artist on The Tuba Thieves is, unbeknownst to her right now, is either going to be in one of the main characters in my next film or is going to be the model for like a character that I'm writing for the next film. So the relationship for me of working with usually hearing sound designers or hearing, sound technicians is I'm really interested in this like power and sensitivity dynamic that we build. Like when I find people who are like experts in sound, but who hand over a kind of like authorship to me, or like really share that in a really deeply collaborative way, I'm so moved by that experience. And so that sometimes will like lead me in my next project. And that's what happened in my first film. The sound designer then made one of the scores for the next film, and now the Foley artist on The Tuba Thieves is becoming a main character in my next film.
We have one more. Should we half a wrap up? Okay. I think we are at time. Thank you so much, Alison. Thank you to you all.
Thank you, Evan.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, The Walker.